All right, good evening, everyone, and I want to thank you all for coming out this evening to join us for this program, which focuses on an analysis of the immigration process in the United States under current immigration policy. This event is sponsored by the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights. I am Ken Clark, the director of the Office of Human Rights, and have been working with a project of which this program is a part. It's part of a larger piece, a campus community collaboration which seeks to address racism, dispossession, and migration. It was funded by Cornell Just Futures engagement grant. This project aims to highlight and support the experiences and positionality of immigrants locally and nationally. It intends to disrupt pervasive misinformation and deception regarding the reality of migrants. Toward that end, we've also been working on the creation of a documentary with Thomas Hubble Photography and Video. And the documentary is called Are We There Yet? The documentary places the experiences and the voices of immigrants at the center of discourse in this documentary. And we are happy to announce the premiere of this documentary will occur on Thursday, October 17th at 6 p.m. at Cinemapolis. If you're interested in receiving information about this event, please leave your name on the pad right there. There's a pen that goes along with it. And let us know if you would like to receive information. Before I go further, I want to make several acknowledgments. Tompkins County government operates in the sovereign territory of the Cayuga Nation, member of the Haudenosaunee Confederation. We are grateful for the opportunity to work here and extend our respect to their people and elders. Secondly, I want to acknowledge the intellectual prowess, hard work, and creativity of Cornell seniors with whom I've had the pleasure of working with over the past 2 fall semesters to gather data to create this programming. I also want to thank their professor, Dr. Jen Micah of the Dyson School of Applied Economics, for helping facilitate this collaboration through the Dyson Grand Challenges project curriculum. Dr. Micah also referred Tom Hubble to us to create the documentary. I want to also extend thanks to Richard Rivera, who was formerly the Director of Academic Reentry Services for Cornell's Prison Education Program, for his contributions to this collaboration over the last couple of years. Also, too, I want to thank my county colleague, Rob Henry, who works with county communications for the tech support that will enable us to transport this event onto our YouTube page. And that's where it will stay for posterity, however long posterity will be. And so we are grateful for his technical skills in assisting us today. Tonight, we are fortunate to have with us 2 immigration experts who will provide an analysis of the immigration process. Kristal Ozmun is a partner in Miller Mayor's Immigration Practice Group and a specialist in immigration law and corporate law. She is a member of the New York State and Massachusetts bars and earned her bachelor's degree from the College of Charleston and Suffolk University Law School. Jaclyn Kelley-Widmer is a clinical professor at Cornell Law School. She teaches first-year lawyering and founded and currently directs Cornell's first 1L clinic, the Immigration Law and Advocacy Clinic. This clinic provides first-year law students guidance in the counseling of clients on immigration cases, performs research and writing for actual cases, and engages in community advocacy on emerging immigrant issues. She earned her BA from Ithaca College and her JD from the University of Michigan Law School. So I'm going to give the program over to them to lead us through this analysis.
Great. I guess I'll start. I'll say hi, I'm Kristal. I'm a partner at Miller-Meyer. If you don't know, we're located just across the street above Viva on the Commons. As Ken said, I am in the immigration practice group at Miller-Meyer. We do focus primarily on employment-based immigration, but we do a fair amount of family-based immigration as well. I think Jackie and I's roles here tonight is to sort of provide a contrast of, the standard immigration pathways that are available to some immigrants and contrast them with that barriers that exist for other individuals who aren't maybe qualified for those pathways or aren't otherwise eligible for them. So to that end, I'll speak more to the former, and Jackie probably to the latter. So I'll let her take it away.
Thanks, Kristal, and thanks, Ken, for inviting us, and to your whole team for having us. We really appreciate it, and it's nice to see you all today. So I'm Jackie, and I am teaching at Cornell Law School, and like Kristal said, I am focusing more on the humanitarian and family-based side of immigration, although I have a project now working with DACA recipients and undocumented individuals to try to move them onto employment-based pathways as well. So I just wanted to start today by talking for a moment about narratives and media stories. That is, acknowledging that when we come into this presentation today, we all have some background of what we think is going on in the immigration world that's generally informed by media and perhaps common narratives that you might hear in the media or within your communities. And I've just pointed out a few photos or illustrations here that represent different kind of ideas that we have about immigration in the US, whether they're about the border, about undocumented youth, what we call dreamers sometimes, about immigrant communities that are not as commonly represented, but that there's advocacy around. And so I just have this slide so we can kind of acknowledge that we are moving forward to talk about what's really going on and give you some concrete facts and information. I know that Ken mentioned that this program is supported by the Cornell Migrations Initiative, which is working to combat racism and dispossession, and so we want to acknowledge that here. And so I'll just briefly mention that in the US today, there's about 46 million immigrants, people born elsewhere, and about 35 million of them have lawful status. So the vast majority have lawful status, but that does leave 11 million people who are undocumented or who don't have lawful status. And so that's just some context. California, New York, and Texas are among the states with the most immigrants, but immigrants do live all over the country, and we'll show you some maps later on. But first, we are going to get an overview of what the system looks like from Kristal.
Sure. Thanks, Jackie. So from the immigration lawyer perspective, when we think of immigration, we generally think of three different buckets of people, if you will. And those are non-immigrants, permanent residents, and US citizens. When we're talking about non-immigrants, these are individuals that are normally tied to an entity. So in other words, their status in the US is contingent on their continuing affiliation with that entity. So for example, if an individual is here in H-1B status, which you guys probably hear about in the news, it's the basic work visa, their status here is contingent upon them remaining employed by the employer sponsor. In the same vein, if you're here as a student, your status is contingent upon you remaining a full-time student at the university that sponsored you. In contrast, permanent residents or green card holders are not tied to a specific entity. So they can live and work anywhere in the United States, but they do have some restrictions. For example, they can't vote and they can't serve on juries, and they are required to retain the United States as their permanent and primary residence. When you become a US citizen, however, you can technically live and work anywhere in the world, obviously contingent upon whatever the immigration laws are in the country that you move to. But you're not subject to those same restrictions. You're not required to make the US your permanent or your primary residence. And then you obviously get the benefit of being able to vote and to do jury duty, and you don't have any sort of corresponding fear of removal from the United States, which still exists if you're a permanent resident. So in order to actually get permanent residence in the US, you do have to have a sponsor generally. And generally that sponsor is either a family member or an employer. So there are humanitarian pathways that are available, for example, refugee status, asylee status, but in contrast to the other categories, those represent a very, very small number of the people who get permanent resident status in the US each year. Additionally, it's important to keep in mind that some of the things that you hear about in the news, like TPS, which is temporary protected status, or DACA, those don't provide clear pathways to permanent residence at all. And finally, you should keep in mind that even those who are eligible for these categories, whether it's family or employment-based, many of them are subject to very, very long waiting lines before they can actually acquire permanent resident status. And to give you sort of an overview of that, I don't expect you to understand this, but this is something called the Visa Bulletin that comes out every month. It's issued by the Department of State, and it lets people who are wanting to apply for permanent residence know where they are in the line. And so just to give you context, we'll look at, let's say, F4. So F4 is if you are someone who has a US citizen brother or sister who sponsored you for permanent residence. If you were from the Philippines and your brother or sister put in an application to sponsor you before February 1st of 2004, so over 20 years ago, you would just now in October be eligible to apply for permanent residence. And some of these waiting lines are even longer. So even if you have a pathway to permanent residence, you might have a very, very long wait time until you actually get there. So this chart sort of gives you an example of what I said earlier, which is that most of the pathways to permanent residence are not humanitarian based. So despite the fact that you may hear them referenced a lot in the news, most people who acquire permanent residence in the United States come through one of these other categories. So to provide context here, in 2022, which is what this is from, about 1 million people received permanent residence in the United States. So of those million, 42% got them on the basis of sponsorship from an immediate relative, and that means you have a US citizen spouse, parent, or child. So 42% of that 1 million is in that category. The employment-based classifications accounted for 27% of the green cards that were issued in 2022. And you can see this very small sliver up there. Only 8% were people who came through a refugee or asylum-based pathway. So unfortunately, these constitute a very, very small number of individuals. Also keep in mind that this chart doesn't encompass those that don't have a clear pathway to permanent residence. So the question then is, what happens to those individuals? And Jackie is going to give us some more insight into that.
All right, thanks, Kristal. So I'll pick it up for a few slides and we'll trade again. So the question here, what if you can't get a green card? So Kristal's been using the term lawful permanent residency or permanent residency. That's another way of saying a green card. The most common way you might hear just anecdotally is green card, and that's because the cards used to actually be green. Now they aren't always green, but anyway, that's what we think of. Okay, so residency, green card, it means the same thing, right? It means that you are, as Kristal was showing you, unlikely to be removed from the US. Still possible, but unlikely, and it puts you on this path to citizenship. So you can't move from, say, refugee status to citizenship directly. First, you have a time period while you have permanent residency or a green card. So the only way to move to citizenship is to have some kind of those other visa pathways that Kristal talked about that get you the green card first, okay, then citizenship. But a lot of people are not eligible for a green card. And as I mentioned earlier, about 11.2 million people are undocumented in the United States. And so I'll explain that there's two ways for people to become undocumented, meaning that they don't have any lawful permission from the US government to be in the United States. one way is that people come with some kind of visa, and the visa is term limited. Maybe it's a student visa, or it's a 3-year work visa, or something like that, and they overstay their visa, meaning their time period of authorization expired and they didn't leave. Then they become undocumented, or they have no lawful status for being in the US. The other way, of course, that we hear more about is just crossing over the border, just walking over, swimming over, right? And so we know that that's, of course, the way lots of people come as well. But more on that later, because we have various administrations who are trying to deal with that at the border. So we can just see here, this is the rough breakdown of the highest percentages of countries of origin of undocumented immigrants. So we have Mexico at the top, of course, far and away, but there's lots of reasons for that we won't go into. And then we have India, China, the Philippines. You notice that Mexico, India, China, and the Philippines are the 4 countries that were broken out on our visa bulletin a few slides back. They are the countries from which we have the most immigrants in any category, including undocumented and documented. Okay, so next I just wanted to point out that immigrants live in all states in the US. And I had mentioned earlier that New York, California, Texas, but also Florida and New Jersey have some of the highest populations of undocumented immigrants, and they do live everywhere, although this slide notes, and you probably can't read it, that this is not only undocumented immigrants, rather this is immigrants generally, but less than 2% of West Virginia's population has immigrants. So it varies across the states, but immigrants do live in all states. So when we want to think about what are some of the options outside of the employment-based pathways and the family-based pathways, I have family petitions and employment-based options at the bottom, but I wanted to first focus on these other types of visas that are humanitarian options. We know from our pie chart that those who receive humanitarian options are very limited, but here's some other ways that people can find themselves in a more stable position, although not completely stable. So DACA, you've heard of perhaps, called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And I'm going to go into some detail about that on the next few slides. Kristal mentioned TPS, Temporary Protected Status, which is a status designated by the federal government when there's some kind of emergency or catastrophe that has happened in a country, and then the government can designate that country, people who are here from that country, to have some kind of temporary status. A U visa is for people who have suffered crimes in the United States and who participate in the prosecution of those crimes. A T visa is for those who've survived human trafficking. Special immigrant juvenile status is for people under 21 who've been abused, neglected, or abandoned by one or both of their parents and can't return to their home country. So these kind of middle options, U, T, and SIJS, special immigrant juvenile status, are for people who've basically experienced some kind of crime. And the public policy considerations that the government is thinking about is let's protect people who are the most vulnerable among us, right? And so in my work, I do represent people from these various categories pretty often. And then we have asylum, which we'll talk more about as well. But asylum is for people who fear persecution in their home country and they cannot get government protection for that persecution. Persecution doesn't just mean any kind of harm, though. It means harm on the basis of one of the protected reasons that's listed in the statute, which is if someone is fearing harm because of their political opinion, race, religion, nationality, or some kind of group that they're a part of, like being an LGBT person. Okay, so these are the other pathways that could exist. And I want to talk some more, like I said, about deferred action for childhood arrivals, or DACA, because this is very commonly in the news and has been for a long time, but the requirements for it are here. And what I want to explain is that DACA, which was started by the Obama administration in 2012, is really just a way of the government saying, we are not going to deport you. we're not going to give you any kind of visa. There's no path to citizenship. You can't travel outside the country without extra special permissions, right? You don't get any of those benefits. You can't petition anyone, and you're going to have to reapply every 2 years and keep paying to reapply every 2 years. But we at least just won't deport you, and we'll give you work authorization. It's a form of prosecutorial discretion, or as I've explained it sometimes, it's as if law enforcement can't necessarily enforce every single type of infraction that might happen, and so they're going to choose to just not go after people who, say, are jaywalking across the street. Okay, so this is like a low-level offense in the immigration universe because these folks were brought to the U.S. as kids, and they had to have come before 15 and have applied before they were 15. However, I won't go through all these requirements, but suffice to say that this program had a 5-year look-back period when it started, which meant that you had to have been in the U.S. since before June 15, 2007. It's just pinned to the day that this was announced by the Obama administration. And it means that these requirements have never been updated, and so now it doesn't really apply to only people who are young. The average DACA recipient is in their late 20s. The oldest ones are 42. That's still young to me. But anyway, we know that this has never been expanded. It's also in litigation. So my clinic works a lot with people who have deferred action for childhood arrivals. A little bit more about that. It has been under attack in and out through different administrations and through lots of different litigation. And so when Trump was elected, he rescinded DACA in 2007, and then a bunch of states sued and said you can't rescind DACA because people rely on it. And then a bunch of other states countersued, and they said you can't do DACA anyway, that was illegal in the first place. And there's a bunch of back and forth political gamesmanship and where you file a case in Texas and stuff like that. But basically, what is left is that the Supreme Court said it was unlawful to rescind DACA. So DACA still exists, but only for people who already had it in 2020. No one can apply for it newly. And now the Fifth Circuit, one of our federal circuit courts, is going to hear the case about whether DACA itself was lawful, because the Supreme Court didn't comment on that last time. So actually October 10th, coming right up, we are going to hear the oral arguments in the Fifth Circuit in New Orleans, and we are anticipating that the court will find that DACA was unlawfully created, which probably will lead the Biden administration to appeal, although we see the clock running out on the Biden administration, so not clear what will happen next. We do anticipate that if there's an appeal from that, the Supreme Court will take up that case and probably find that DACA was indeed unlawfully created. So although we do a lot of work in this area, and it has been a program that's benefited a lot of people for 12 years, there's sort of like mixed takes on it, and we'll see what happens with the next president as well. That the next administration will have an impact on whether this continues. But in the meantime, we do still have the Biden administration, and there's a few new policies that were announced in June you might have heard about. One of them is called parole in place. In the immigration world, parole means like an entry to, sort of, to the United States. And so what you're saying when someone is undocumented, when they get a parole, it means you're just switching them from being completely without any kind of authorization to sort of giving them this temporary permission to be here. And this parole in place program has been used for a long time for undocumented spouses of people in the military, but Biden administration decided to open it to anyone who's undocumented and lives and is married to a U.S. citizen. So that's very, very exciting because a lot of people come through family petitions, right? We know that. We saw 27% of people it was like 42% are coming through immediate relatives, their spouses, right? But what we didn't mention was if you came unlawfully in the first place, you cannot get your green card that way. So a lot of people think, okay, I'm just going to marry my U.S. citizen partner, and then I will have an option to move forward and just get my green card. But no, not if you walked across the border without permission in the first place. That only works if you had permission when you originally arrived. So this parole in place program is a way of forgiving that unlawful entry and saying, you know what, we are just going to let everybody who's married to a U.S. citizen adjust their status, get a green card. We're not going to worry about whether they entered lawfully. Okay, that was what that program was for, but it is temporarily paused now because of litigation. So, okay, TBD, what happens in that program? Now, the other thing that's going on is kind of less salient to explain, and the media hasn't quite picked up on what's going on here, is this special kind of waiver called the D3 waiver. It's got a really boring name because it's just named after the provision in the statute where it comes from. But it's basically like a blanket way to forgive someone's immigration violation, particularly if their only violation was just unlawful presence. That is, just living in the US without permission. And we already know there's lots of ways for that to happen. There's 11.2 million people doing that right now. And so this is a way for people to ask the government to forgive that time that they were in the US without permission and pick up a work visa that they already have been approved for. Because right now, a DACA recipient might say, oh, I finished my degree, I'm a nurse, I've got a job offer from this hospital, and they can't find anyone to fill it, and they're gonna sponsor me for an H-1B. Oh, but I can't get it because I have this unlawful presence, and the only way to pick up one of these work visas is to go outside the country, get it at the consulate. Once you leave the country, it's complicated to get back in unless the government has forgiven you for this. And it says here, first case is ongoing now. I'm representing someone who went to his home country last week. We're working with the Department of State to get this waiver approved, and it's coming along, it's coming. You see the news soon, okay. This is a new policy, right? And the Biden admin is sort of working with my team on this. So it's very exciting, but it's not easy to sort of like encapsulate the way you can explain for only place. All right, just a few other things. I want to talk about the border. Because we just were talking about people who've been here a long time, right? The undocumented spouses, the DACA holders, but also, of course, we see a lot in the media about who is arriving now. And so this photo is from January 2024, and it just, it shows people arriving at the US-Mexico border. We see that a lot of people who arrive at the border now actually do turn themselves in when they get there, in part because they are hoping to be able to ask for asylum or protection. And a lot of people remain detained in immigration detention, not families and kids though, typically men and women. But I had the most recent stats I had pulled were from December of 2023, 137,000 immigrants were in detention on an average day. And that remains true. It's 38,000 immigrants detained on an average day, usually recent arrivals. Okay, but I get ahead of myself. So the southern border, I wanted to just point out, of course, this is where we think of immigration as happening, and it is happening. And so here's the highlighted states of Mexico and the US where folks are coming in. But one of the interesting things that we see, right, we saw a few slides back that the highest number of immigrants in the US, undocumented immigrants particularly, are from Mexico. But in recent years, at the border, we're actually seeing a real shift in demographics of countries of origin where people are coming from. And this merits looking at. This shows some information about people, the number of people encountered at the border by Customs Border Protection on any given day. And it's a little bit hard to follow because some of the orange section was from Title 42, which was when the Trump administration tried to close the border under COVID reasons and was turning people away sort of summarily at the border. So if you don't count those, it still is high, but it's not the highest it's ever been if you look back to 2000. And you can see that it is higher, but these folks who came in the orange time usually are having to come more than once. So this is encounters, but not number of people, number of individuals. But looking now at the nationality of folks, I know that this is like very difficult to read from where you are, but what I want to point out is that back in 2008, we saw that the highest number of people coming was from Mexico, which is this dark blue bar here. And the other countries are, let's see, the orange, green, and blue are El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. So those are the countries in Central America we sometimes call the Northern Triangle. And then the purple is just everybody else. So you think about that, you can see that the numbers were lower in 2008, but the number of Mexicans has actually declined quite a bit, and now it has gone up again, but noticing that the folks from the Northern Triangle countries have really grown, starting around 2013, 14, grown a lot, and now though, the real category that has grown is everyone else, the purple category. After 2021, we've seen huge leaps in people from all other places in the world, such that now we have about half the people that are arriving at the southern border are coming from places other than Mexico and El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. So really different demographics at the southern border, and I see this when I take my law students to immigration detention. I'm talking with people from Uzbekistan and Mauritania and Turkey and all over the world. This is another way that sort of maybe is a little bit easier to see. And this way, the blue is still Mexico, but then the orange is those Northern Triangle countries. The green, they break out Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. For government reasons, those people are under similar programs. And so they're categorized together, and then all other countries. So still 30% of people arriving are from all of the rest of the world. It's really a lot. It's a really different look at the border. And of course, I wanted to talk about briefly the northern border, because we are much closer. Of course, we are a border state too. And in recent years, we've seen a lot more people coming to the northern border in this unauthorized kind of way, attempting to cross and seek admission. And so I don't have the most updated statistics, but for the first 3 months of this year, there were 1.2 million arrests at the northern border. Okay, not just New York, but the entire northern border in the first 3 months of this year. And the year before, it was 3.2 for the whole year. So we were seeing that it was ahead of prior numbers. And there was an interview that there were people of at least 70 different nationalities that had entered from Augsburg to Vermont in that stretch right there. 70 different nationalities. Top countries were Mexico, India, Bangladesh, Haiti, Venezuela, and Romania. And so I just want to point out that there's a lot going on at the northern border too. And when I work with my students, sometimes we go to the detention center that's in Batavia, it's kind of like over here. And we see people from all over, including who've tried to enter at the northern border. Okay, so with that, I wanted to turn it back to Kristal. She's going to talk about the legal options for these folks who are recently arrived.
So Jackie already sort of touched on these briefly, but the two primary ones that you probably hear about are refugee status and asylee status. And I think they're also sort of thrown around interchangeably by people both in the news and elsewhere. But actually, they have two different, I guess they have the same base underlying requirement, which is that both have to demonstrate either persecution or fear of persecution based on race, persecution, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. But they are very different in terms of what they actually mean. So refugees are by definition outside of the US physically. So if you're applying for refugee status, you are necessarily by definition physically outside of the United States. The other difference, primary difference between refugee seekers and asylum seekers is that the number of people that can be admitted from outside the US in refugee status each year is set by the president in consultation with Congress. So necessarily those numbers are much higher now. So they've been 125,000 for the past couple of years. But for example, under Trump, I think at least 1 year was as low as 18,000. So that is one area where a difference in administration will play a substantial difference, and we'll talk about that a little bit further later. In contrast, asylum seekers are not subject to any particular cap in a given year. So essentially, like I said, they have the same base requirement, but an individual seeking asylum is either applying from within the United States or you can apply at a port of entry. And there is no cap on the number of asylum applications that can be submitted or approved in a given year. So consequently, those numbers have soared, which you hear about a lot in the news. So just to give you a bit of context, in 2023, there was more than 900,000 total asylum applications made. About half were presented to the Immigration Service, to USCIS, and those were what we call affirmative asylum applications. And the other approximately half or so were submitted to immigration courts in a process that's known as defensive asylum. So if you're already in removal proceedings, for example, you might be able to submit a defensive asylum application. To give you a sense of the numbers, right now there's also a backlog of about 1 million asylum applications at USCIS and about another, I think, 1 million in the immigration courts. So we're talking a very, very large number of people. So looking at those numbers, how many people actually get asylum each year? It's pretty low in comparison, and necessarily it also fluctuates based on the administration usually. So in 2022, the number was about 36,600 individuals were granted asylum, which is a 120% increase from 2021, which was about 16,600. So under Trump, gives you an idea. But also a very big drop in comparison to 2019, had 45,800 approximately individuals were granted asylum. So big differences between the two. And I think I sort of skipped over a slide here. So these are pathways, unfortunately, that are available to very limited groups of people. And unfortunately, they're also being eroded even further depending upon the administration that's in power. And that's not necessarily just the Trump administration. So the two that we're going to talk about briefly here, and Jackie, I'd offer you to jump in if you have anything to add, please, because I'll have to give a summary here, but you might have more context. But just in May of 2023, the Biden administration issued what's called the Circumvention of Lawful Pathways Regulation, or CLP. I think in the news it's sometimes called the Asylum Transit Ban. It wasn't joined by a federal court, but I think it is still being litigated in the Ninth Circuit, and unfortunately during any of those appeals remains still in effect. So what the CLP did is it created a rebuttable presumption, meaning it's assumed that you are not eligible for asylum, and that's based on how the non-citizen entered the United States and whether they applied for protection in transit. And if it is found to apply, the individual is no longer eligible for asylum, and instead they're only eligible for these other two pathways, which are called withholding of removal or the Convention Against Torture. And the downside of those two is that they have a much higher legal standard for you to receive relief under. And they don't allow a pathway for your dependents or derivatives, so like a minor child to come with you. And they also don't have direct pathways for citizenship. So necessarily, this unfortunately puts you at a great disadvantage. So even if you have those other pathways, they're much more limited. So not great. And then really just the other day, unfortunately, oh, this one's coming up slowly. Beginning of June, the Biden administration introduced securing the border, which unfortunately predicates access to asylum on the border numbers. So we looked at those earlier. Jackie went over them. They're pretty astounding. And the trigger is, let me make sure I get this right, a 7-day consecutive calendar average of 2,500 encounters or more among the ports of entry. And if you remember those stats, they were quite a bit higher than that. in order for this switch, if you will, this trigger to come undone, there has to be 14 calendar days after there is a 7-day consecutive average of 1,500 or less encounters. So based on the numbers that we're seeing, that basically means that this bar will be in effect pretty much all the time. Unfortunately, is what it seems like is predicted. So it effectively results in a ban on people making application for asylum at a port of entry unless you fall into one of the accepted categories, which are generally people, there's a few, but it's, for example, if you already had a lawful non-immigrant visa status here, like H-1B or F or something like that, or a few other exceptions, but they're very limited, unfortunately. So that is what we might see going forward. Anything we should add to that, Jackie?
No, I guess just that the idea here is that people cannot get asylum if the number coming through the border is too high. And the way that Biden said it was a level that always is surpassed at the border or very frequently. And so it's sort of like a way of not saying we're closing the border to asylum, but making rules that make that happen. And so that's why Kristal said, well, it's not just a Trump administration that puts restrictions on asylum at the border.
Unfortunately. So we're almost done. What happens next? I mean, there are a couple of good things that have happened recently, so we thought maybe we'd highlight a few of those. So TPS status, this temporary protected status, which also provides a pathway to work authorization for individuals, was recently extended to Venezuela. And I frankly have seen a huge uptick in the number of Venezuelan nationals who make use of TPS status, so that's been great. A couple other things, humanitarian parole was recently expanded, interestingly, to include Cuba, Haiti, and Nicaragua. And net migration on the whole is at the highest level that we've ever seen since 2017. So that does at least bring it to the forefront of Americans' minds. But with that being said, what that looks like going forward will somewhat be dependent on the next administration. I guess, under Harris, if that was who's elected next and who we hope, we would probably expect a continued focus on some of these humanitarian programs, as well as maybe some efficiencies and streamlining of legal immigration processes. Under Trump, you would probably see some of these, for example, TPS maybe not being redesignated for certain countries, maybe ending of certain humanitarian parole programs. What we saw in sort of the employment and family-based context was things like imposing higher standards for approval of certain categories, also rescinding policies like deference policies that they had in place. But those, all of these are sort of small in the grand context of things. The truth is what we really need is immigration reform. And that's something that has to be accomplished by Congress. So whether it's Harris or Biden, the changes are going to be more, even though they might be amplified in the news, on the actual, implementation level, they don't have a lot of authority in terms of making large-scale changes is really the bottom line. So while we definitely are hoping for a nice administration, unfortunately, I'm not sure I have much hope for immigration reform, but we'll keep our fingers crossed. Anything you want to add?
No, I think we can go to the last one has our contact, and then we can we'll take any questions. Thank you so much for listening to
yes, thank you guys for coming.
Complicated and detailed overview.
Time for questions.
It is.
Okay, great. Is there still busing going on from the border? Are there states that are still doing that?
I think that is still happening, but and it is. I think that there are cities, even in upstate New York, who continue to receive folks, but it's less prominent in the news, I think, because it's happening somewhat less, and because people have figured out systems to accommodate it. Yeah. What do you?
Yeah, I think that's true. I haven't heard any major news stories either on it lately.
But there are groups in Rochester and Buffalo and others who are working with folks who
migrant
migrant.
accepted,
Yeah,
like in
or-
advance, in contrast to some of the ones that were just being bused to random cities without advance approval.
Yeah.
Or notice.
What's that?
Or notice.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not like that.
Are the places that you just referenced that are accepting people, is that through the state program to accept people from other places, or is that completely independent? Because there was a thing that got passed, and I don't know what the status is of the New York State program for upstate cities to accept people that have been bused into New York City. Or is that what you're talking about, or are those completely humanitarian groups of separate and NGO kind of things?
No, I don't think it's separate. I think it's all part of the same program, although I don't know the details of how it's supported either statewide or by New York City. But I know that there's coordination, and the coordination is happening with local groups, I believe.
Yeah, I just wonder why there's so little compassion for immigrants coming from other parts of the world. I'm an immigrant myself, and I have issues of my own because I am a green card holder, but my green card is no good anymore. That's what they say, So, I mean, I work. I'm not gonna say who I work for at this point, but basically, I'm legally here because otherwise, I pay the IRS, I pay my taxes, I do all that stuff. But it seems like people seem to have forgotten that this country really was formed by foreigners. It was not, unless you're a Native American, you're not really from here. I mean, my brother is an American. He was born in Catskill, New York. He's the first generation of my family. I have a son who's an American. I was married to one American who's passed away. I'm married to an American now. I'm an American veteran. I've sworn allegiance to the United States, I don't know how many times in my life, but yet they still say, I'm from England originally, and I'm like, but they label you. This label thing really drives me crazy because you have one part of the government saying, don't label this people, you can't call this person this, you can't do this, you can't do that. But yet, I read some of the immigration papers, and I'm like, well, geez, that's like, have you ever been affiliated with a communist party? Have you ever, all kinds of stupid questions they ask you. And I have some, I'm thinking, really? I want to rebel. Because I come from I've been a free man my whole life, I mean, except for when I screwed up and did something wrong. But other than that, I wonder why that is. Why do people have this mindset that immigrants are bad? Where does that come from? When everybody's really an immigrant, I mean, I know it's not really on the topic. I mean, everything you guys are trying to do is great because people do need help. I mean, I actually have been on your webpage because I need to talk. I have to go talk about this, the legality of it all, because they just made it so complicated that I'm not a stupid man, but I'm like, really? It's and then they up the fees for everything, and I don't get it. Why has it came to this point? Like when they opened Ellis Island, I mean, they used to treat people crappy when they brought them in the country, and sprayed them down, do all kinds of weird things, but they still let them in because they needed them for labor and stuff. But nobody looks at that bad context of that either. That the United States has not been nice to people. I mean, that's a lot of questions, kind of. but I mean, it's disheartening to me, because it's very stressful to me in my life, So
I think, and I don't know, I'll just give a brief thought, but I mean, I think in part to what you just said, I think there's in the news and elsewhere sort of this common view or that is put out there that coming here is easy and you can just come here and you can just work and you can do whatever you want, which is a view that's put out there. And the truth is that actually, as you just said, to acquire status here is actually very complicated. It's very difficult. It's not just a matter of walking across the border and picking up a work permit. That just doesn't happen. And I would guess that maybe that misinformation leads to part of that because, I talk to people who say that. Like, no, that's not how it works. It's not a simple process by any means. Perhaps that's where some of the, what's the word I'm looking for? In any event, you get what I'm saying. I think that some people think that people are coming here very easily and taking advantage perhaps of our resources and such, but that is actually not what's happening.
And I just think there's a lot of xenophobia and fear of the other, and people who want to preserve the status quo because they fear immigrant others, and that has been true since we had borders, right? And you can think back to many waves of immigration that immigrants were demonized or othered in many ways by society, and that continues. I mean, in back to the 1800s when we had the Chinese Exclusion Act, like all the way to now, right? We have different variations on these themes, and I think it relates to this fear and interest in preserving what is perceived as some sort of national power. In your comment about work authorization and or people who can come to work, right? And the idea of like in Ellis Island, people are coming to work. We actually have a huge workforce that is immigrant people, of course, but actually they're undocumented. And I have colleagues who study the interaction between labor and immigration and seeing our actual immigration policies as a form of labor policy, albeit sort of off the books, but is a coerced form of labor because once people come into the US and they cannot get status, they can't leave also because it's too dangerous, too hard to get back. And so you have this permanent underclass of undocumented workers who are easier to exploit and work in all of the dairy farms in upstate New York, among all the other more difficult,
fear-driven
fields to be in.
Yeah, it's really fear-driven.
But who also, this came up earlier today, there's a very large proportion of them who do things like pay taxes for their entire stay here, even though that's been documented. I can't tell you how many people I've consulted with who, and they've done studies of it, that there are many, many people who've been here for many years without status who pay taxes that entire time.
And they can't take advantage of any of the
and
taxes
use the
they're paying.
benefits that they're paying into, exactly, which is an interesting phenomenon.
I spend a great deal of time explaining to people I work with housing homeless and even American-born people who have no money and need services can't get them without Social Security card.
Yes.
So they're not coming over here and getting on welfare.
They don't get any of that.
Because even American citizens can't get it if you don't have the proper, so I'm having these conversations with people.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing to me how the misinformation is so prevalent. But I think that some of that might be, I was really surprised, what I'm taking away from this is the map of how many immigrants lived in each state. And when you see certain states and they have like 4%, they have no basis for comparison. They don't have any idea because they're not exposed to that. So they're not walking along and seeing, like here in Ithaca, all the different faces and races and how it's fine, we're fine.
Do you feel like any countries have an immigration system figured out that we draw from for reform?
I don't know that anyone has it figured out. Certainly there's a lot of studies into looking at whether, Steve has looking at merit-based immigration, but I'm not sure. I think at the end of the day, they all have their pros and cons, right? So I'm not sure. That's a good question.
Yeah, I don't know either. I think that some countries do a better job with asylum than we do.
Yeah, that's true.
That is an area of primary expertise for me. And so, for example, Canada doing a lot better job, and several other countries too. But of course, it's only one small piece. And while asylum is taking up an outsized part of our media conversation and the public consciousness around immigration, it's only 8% of people who are coming in. And so to the other pathways, I mean, there are some countries that have a really different system where there's more ways to be legally present for temporary periods, like for example in Germany or in Spain. But the path to citizenship is super, super narrow. Not all those temporary ways could lead to citizenship, whereas in the US, if you can get that green card, it always leads to citizenship. And so there are other countries that have systems that maybe the status comes more easily, but it can't be made permanent as easily. And so I think there's pros and cons to that too, but I guess what I would hope is that I wish that we could have some more creative exploration around it, because the system we do have isn't working and we really could do better.
I was recently at a seminar for with other agencies that house up homeless, and that's where I learned the difference between refugee and asylum seeker. So I just recently learned that. Does America have any refugee camps? We don't have any, right?
No, we make people wait in Mexico.
Right.
Yeah, it's a program called Remain in Mexico. Yes.
Yes.
Now it's not in the same level of operation as it was under Trump, but it still is the case that people basically, that's what we're doing with the circumvention of lawful pathways rule, and that's what we're doing with the other rules that we were talking about, and forcing people to only be able to come in if they've used the CBP1 app to enter the US to ask for an appointment, which there's only like 1,400 appointments a day, so you're looking at like a year-long wait if you can get the app to work. And so anyway, we like outsource all of that. We also didn't mention the Safe Mobility Offices, which is another program that's in Guatemala and Colombia and a few other countries where we try to do refugee processing in other countries rather than trying to do it here. I think there's been some like mixed success with those, but yes, we do a lot of externalizing the borders in the US.
Isn't there immigration treaties with certain European countries? I mean, like, even like the Versailles Treaty, they stated after World War II, they said that the United States would take so many people from different places to, because of what happened with Germany and that. And I don't know if they still recognize, it's funny how a lot of times these old treaties, you read about them, but they don't recognize a lot of that stuff anymore, It's like, pushed to the side, but it's still a legal document, I thought. Like the Versailles Treaty says a lot of things about the union that they had, even with Russians and Germans. At the time that we helped, that they took into the United States, they took a lot of Germans that, some people today would say, why did they let those people into the United States? Because they had all this knowledge that the United States wanted. And I'm not sure if they still do that. Do they still have treaties with countries that say, okay, yeah, we'll take this person because of this or whatever?
Well, there are certain treaty-based classifications. So TN, for example, is based on, I always forget the new name, it's NAFTA. So that applies to Mexican and Canadian professionals. There's also a classification called E2 or E1, which is treaty trader, treaty investor, which is effectively applies to anyone that we have certain treaties of trade with. So the big exceptions are like China, South Africa, India, obviously are not on that list. But pretty much like every European country is, lots of others. But those are the only ones that I'm aware of that are based on treaties between countries. I don't know if there's anything else that's applicable. But so in limited form, I guess.
Right, and of course, post-World War II, we also had the Refugee Convention.
Yeah.
And so all the asylum rules that we're talking about that require people to be persecuted and meet these different criteria, that's all an international treaty. And that's the rule for most countries that have asylum.
Do we all have the same standards of proof?
Oh, that's a great question. No, we don't.
Are we supposed to? Like, is there a set of standards that some countries apply and some countries don't, or was that just not even a thing?
Oh yes, there's whole books about this. What I can say is that we all are using the same sort of baseline, right? You have to fear persecution, not be able to be protected by your government, race, religion, political opinion, nationality. Okay, those are the criteria. But then the standard of proof, that means like what's the level of likelihood that someone is going to face that persecution, that is set by court decisions. And so in the US, for asylum, you only have to show a 10% chance that you might risk persecution. So that's relatively low bar, but for some of the other forms of relief, like Convention Against Torture relief, you have to show more likely than not, like a 50% chance. And I would guess if you went back to the drafting of the Convention Against Torture, which is another of the international instruments we're a party to, they didn't say like only if you're 50% likely to get tortured. But these standards are set within the countries, these details. So some people argue we are out of compliance with our international obligations because of that. This has been a very robust and fun discussion.
Yeah.
It's been great. Anything else?
You said put your name on this thing if you, to get that information from you?
Yes, if you're interested in attending,
Name, email?
name and contact information. You can do that.
Or mail or email?
Yeah, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. So, well, thank you all for coming out this evening. I mean, this conversation was really, just wonderfully facilitated by our two legal scholars, and it kind of illustrates this sort of seesaw of history in which we, on the one hand, acknowledge our reality as a nation of immigrants. This was a book John F. Kennedy was writing at the time of his assassination. And 2 years after that, the Immigration and Naturalization Act reopened America's borders. And it really rewrote the religious landscape of this country. America is far more religiously diverse today because of that act than it was 60 years ago. But there's always been this xenophobic aspect. I mean, it ebbs and flows. And we continue to be caught in that tension of it and struggling with how do we do this to live up to American ideals. But thank you all so much for your presentation tonight and for you coming out and spending time with us. And again, if you would like to be contacted with publicity about the documentary, Are We There Yet? Please sign your name.
Is that on your website too, with the information about the?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you guys for coming in.
Thank you.